Hi everyone, welcome to Scottish Books to Screen at Industry Focus 2023. We have Ayana, who's going to be moderating the session today, and we have the author of the book, Stuart Cosgrove.
Hi, how are you doing?
Amazing. So this is all very exciting. The film's screening Thursday and Friday. I think they've added more tickets now, but at one point it was sold out, the first screening.
The first screening is sold out, and I think they were adding maybe a few more tickets. I don't know how they do that with the fire regulations, but some have gone online, but there we go.
Yeah. How does it feel to be screening the film at this festival in particular?
Well, obviously, you know, I live in Glasgow. It's where I've lived for the best part of the last 20 odd years. So there's a kind of nice localness about that. And to be able to bring a project which began here, I wrote it in Glasgow, and then it was sold internationally in the States. And Muta Ali was then attached as the director, and him and I then began kind of Zoom calls and a conversation and a friendship built up. And then he actually brought the post-production to Glasgow, so he post-produced in the hub over in the south side of the city near the BBC at the hub building there. And so he's kind of become a surrogate Glaswegian over the time as well. It's a shame he couldn't be here today, but he'll certainly be here for the film, you know.
Yeah. I will get to asking questions about the production and post-production of the film, but I kind of wanted to first ask about just the origins of this book and this film. You started out writing about music mainly, and before Cassius X you had your soul trilogy of books about soul music. How did that end up translating into you writing a book about Muhammad Ali?
Okay, so the Soul Trilogy were a group of 3 books that were about the important kind of years of the high period of 60s soul across 3 different cities, Detroit 67, Memphis 68, and then finally Harlem 69. And I wanted to create a series of kind of books that said something, you know, exciting really about the music that I'd grown up with and had fallen in love with and has been at the core of my life through most of my adult life. And one of the things, it's worth kind of dwelling on them in a wee bit more detail, because quite a lot of the kind of origins really of where the Cassius X idea came from bear some relationship to that trilogy. One of the things I was keen to do was to look at the whole idea of a city as a central character within a piece of work, whether it's a TV drama series or a movie feature film. And Detroit was really very much the kind of passion that kind of drove the idea. Now, subsequently, actually, ironically, films have evolved out of 2 of the books. Questlove's Summer of Soul, which won I think it won the Oscar for Best Film last year, is pretty much predicated on the August of Harlem 69, where the story is told in some detail. And Catherine Bigelow's film Detroit is the story that's told in the July and August of Detroit 67. So you can see that the books have got a very firm footing in the narrative storytelling that leads to people wanting to make films. In the case of Detroit, I had this belief that I wanted to write a book which the city of Detroit was the central character, and you'd meet all of these other characters as you moved across, not unlike some of the great kind of literary books that use a city as their core, you know, the Dublin of Ulysses, that type of thing, and you voyage across the city across the period of the book. And Detroit, I remember keeping a lot of cuttings. You know how you see them all a lot online now, but it used to be that they were on the Monday and Tuesday Guardian when the Guardian newspaper was doing the media, and they would get authors to give you tips about writing, and I always used to keep these top 10 tips and whatever. I'm a real cataloguer of stuff, a bit of a nerd when it comes to things like that, and I'd cut out this thing that Elmore Leonard had written, the greatest ever Detroit crime writer of all time, and his first rule was, never begin your book with the weather. That was his number one role. However, on the first day of January 1967, Detroit was beset with the worst snowstorm in its civic history, and everyone was landlocked in their houses. You couldn't get out, you couldn't drive a car, the airport had closed, the whole city was in gridlock and whiteout. And I thought to myself, do you know what? Fuck Elmer Leonard. I'm going to start with the weather, and I started with this great snowstorm which opens the book. But that was actually purposefully also to lock the central character, one of the central characters, Berry Gordy, the owner of Motown Records, in his home. As he walks around in his house, I imagine him trying to kind of deal with all of the things that are coming to trouble him that year. So it's a wee bit like setting your New Year resolutions, but of course I wasn't in the room. I don't know exactly what he was thinking, but what I was able to do was to kind of give you the opening of where the big challenges for the Motown Corporation were at that year, one of which was the dispute within the Supremes, and the eventual sacking of Florence Ballard, who's one of the central characters, sad character in the core of the book. So the books have all got a kind of filmic, character-led feel to them, and in some respects, that's kind of the way that I like writing, and it led me to think of a personal challenge that I set myself, which I think is pretty consistent across all the books, which is to make every single character you write about at length complex in the true sense of that. I don't really believe in the whole idea of goodies and baddies and people who've got very kind of simplistic, narrowly conceived sets of values. Quite a lot of the stuff that's been written about Berry Gordy over the past has cast him really in a kind of villainous role because he's a successful capitalist owner of a record company, so you can see how easy it would be to stereotype this man, and I wanted to work against that for a simple reason, actually, a reason that's not unlike this room. I had grown up in Glasgow working for Channel 4 and developing independent production companies for film and television, and I knew numerous independent producers, and I knew how tough their life was and how big a challenge it was to run a company and build a successful brand from a relatively and from the regions, if you like, because Detroit is clearly not New York and it's not Hollywood and LA either. And here's this man that's achieved almost the unthinkable, to build a global media brand from a comparatively small city. And therefore I wanted to portray him as a much more complex character than the traditional way of thinking about it. So to cut a long story short, the books are full of that kind of level of complex characterization. The hardest challenge of all was a guy called Reggie Harding, who was 7'5", and he was a criminal, and he was the man that raped Florence Ballard, and the book explains how that comes about. Now, casting him in anything other than quite a dark light was quite troubling, and there's a scene in the book where he lives in this kind of wooden house in Detroit that has been built for people who are kind of 5'8", and he's 7'4", and his mother has just died, and his father, who's a local preacher, hates his son, hates that he's become a star basketball player, hates that he's a heroin addict, and they have to have Christmas together, the two of them sitting over this table, one of whom's so tall he can't even get out the door without crouching. So even in that character, you could see through in his darkness that there was something more interesting about him, and that, phenomenologically he'd been himself a victim of quite a lot of things in his life. So I love that challenge of taking characters and making them as complex as I can. So to answer the question you asked me, I'd written these books, and I was very keen to write a book about the origins of soul music, or at least the early part of the 1960s, and I flapped around looking for a city that could be my central character. And briefly I thought about the city of Miami, which has got a great kind of African-American music scene, but I didn't really feel comfortable that it was so well known in the way that Motown is, or Stax and Memphis are, that I kind of got a wee bit shy of it. And then as I started to read about Muhammad Ali's early career, He had been born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky, but because he was part of Angelo Dundee's training academy, he moved to Miami at a very early age as a teenager, and spent 3 or 4 years in Overtown, the ghetto in Miami. And that gave me the sense that I could write about the music through that prism. And so Muhammad Ali became the central character of the book. Now, he's going through quite a fundamental period of time in his life. He's beginning the relatively long conversion to Islam. The way that it's told in conventional biographies of him is that he wins a title and the Nation of Islam got the grips into him and called him Muhammad Ali, and it's all done over like 4 days. In reality, it was over something like 2.5 years, where for a long period of time, unknown to the vast majority of people in mainstream America, he was living his life as Cassius X, because the conversion requirement, the first statement of your conversion when you join the Nation of Islam, is to eliminate your slave name and to cross it out and become X. So he got rid of the name Marcellus Clay, which was his slave name, and became Cassius X, which of course is probably now more famous in people's minds with Malcolm X, but that's common for people who've joined the Nation of Islam, and he took on that. But all of his contracts were in the name of Cassius Marcellus Clay, and only after he'd won the heavyweight title of the world was he given this special name that was gifted to him by the Nation of Islam, Muhammad Ali. So it tells the story of his young life up until the point at which he becomes Muhammad Ali. And one of the big arguments that I had, not really with myself, but more with kind of, people can get a wee bit, sometimes when people have some knowledge, they impose. People have said to me, don't call him Cassius, it's not his name. And he said, well, it is for the period of this book. That was exactly what his name was. His name was Cassius X, and he was hiding that from quite a lot of people, including his own parents, because he'd signed contracts in the name of Cassius Marcellus Clay, but in order to advance his conversion in the Nation of Islam, he had eliminated his slave name, which he kind of was not entirely enthusiastic about, because the original Marcellus Clay, who was a slave owner historically, was a very, very big abolitionist, probably the most famous abolitionist in the state of Kentucky. So there's a degree of Cassius that had a bit of a pride in his name, and wasn't to begin with that enthusiastic about eliminating it, but he did,
Yeah. I think the book really does lend itself to film so well, just because it's so rich in detail, and also just because it's not the conventional biography of Muhammad Ali. It's focusing on this very specific point in his life, and I guess that's why it lends itself to film so well. I'm curious, just if you could set the scene of when and where you were first approached about turning this book into a film. Okay,
so just to pick up on that first point you make, which I think is a really quite an important one, is biopics, or and there are quite a lot of them around in the film world, suffer from often being conceived by the author or the screenplay writer as cradle to grave. So they kind of think, right, I need to now focus on the day she was born, what the upbringing was like, what their parental home life was like, and then what their last 20 years of their life was like after their period of notoriety or fame or whatever. And I didn't want to do one of those cradle-to-grave things. There's a lot of great books that have been written about Muhammad Ali. Thomas Hauser's book about him is exactly that. It's a cradle-to-grave book, and great and phenomenal. But I wanted to focus on this period when he was in Miami and when he was Cassius X. The first I got from it, okay, so that takes you into the world of optioning, right? So to kind of give people, most people will have an idea what that means, but most books are optioned by a filmmaker or a production company, and the period of option that you're offered varies enormously with what they're able to pay or whatever, but usually optioning, I've seen the option period now extending over my lifetime, and it's now closer to kind of 3 years. as an option period that people are looking for. And the reason that filmmakers or producers are looking for a 3-year option on a book is that it takes that to even get close to getting funded to make it. So it used to be that you get options for a year, and that's kind of fantasy land in a way, that you will get a book, that you will be able to shape a script with a script writer, take it to market, and in a complex market find the funding to get it made in that year. Just not going to happen. I don't know anything that works like that. So 3 years is more common now, and usually what happens is that a production company will show their interest in the book, and they will approach you or your agent about how much you would be willing to accept for the option on the book, and all the rights in the book remain with you, the author, but they have an option for the 3 years to develop it into a script and to have, if you like, preference on it. So to give you a kind of glimpse into that, the Soul trilogy has been optioned by Altitude Films, a London film company, and they've reissued the option now twice that I'm aware of. So it was a 2-year option, so not quite 6 years yet, because they've still got another 1.5 years to run, but probably 4 or 5 years. And they've looked at different ways of kind of funding that project, and it's still not yet happened as a film. So Cassius X kind of leapfrogged that, and it was optioned originally here in Glasgow by Two Rivers, who are a production company in Glasgow, and it was Mick and Alan Clements from the company that approached me about the option, and I, because I know them as friends or contacts within the Glasgow industry, I kind of put them on to my publisher and said, let them negotiate with you, and they did, and they pay an option fee for, I think they took an option for 2 years, which is just as well, because it's taken them 2 years to get it done. I wish it'd run out. But basically I then get a fee from my rights agency or publisher, and it can vary enormously. I mean, in Scotland you can pay as little as £1,000 for an option, or as much as 8,000, 10,000. You tend not to get Scottish books getting into the major option world of auctions and and brown envelopes and all that. That tends not really to happen, and that may be something to do with the power of our publishing industries and the fact that we've got a relatively small industry of writers. There's a whole range of reasons why that might be, but I think I ended up getting 2,500 for it. Now, that might have been that they bid 3 and publishers kept 500 they never told me about. I don't know. But I think that came into my bank account was 2,500, right? And I'm very happy with that, because, I'm not exactly selling the big issues, so it's nice to have that money coming in. But more importantly, it's nice to see a film from Scotland getting made within a US context, when you've got an African-American director and it's being post-produced in Glasgow but shown in America, and then it will feature here at the film festival then later in the year. I think it opens in October, Black History Month, and then goes all over England and elsewhere in Scotland and Ireland. That's the plans for it just now, but it's already gone out in the Smithsonian Channel in America last Wednesday, and performed extremely well in terms of their overnight ratings, so they're repeating it, and so it's actually already a success, if you like, by terms of the measurements that you might want to place on it.
Yeah, it's nice to know that people are seeing the work.
No, absolutely brilliant. And the other thing about it really is that if you're interested in optioning stuff, don't be scared. I mean, talk directly in the first instance to the writer, because often it's the case that writers, I don't have an agent, so really in a way I make that decision for myself, because just simply because I'd rather know what the motivations are at somebody that wants to buy or option my work. I want to kind of see them, talk about them, what's their concept of it, and I don't want that to be filtered through an agent who has another agenda, which is to maximise the price. Nothing wrong with that, but that's not necessarily the way that I look at it. And so I could sit down with Mick McAvoy and with Alan Clements and say, what do you have in mind? And we talked at length. For example, we made the decision and it became increasingly an expectation of an African American director, because we were originally talking about this prior to the summer of Black Lives Matter, and that had an exponentially important impact on the American industry, where the expectation now of you know, casting diversely, of involving African American talent when it's relevant, and clearly in this case it was profoundly relevant because it was an African American subject matter. And so we were keen to hire someone and get somebody on board as a director that could do that, and Muta Ali, if he was here now, he would talk a bit about that. But he became the director, having had also some experience in making factual-based programming, and that was quite an important part of the storytelling. I think maybe are there things within the book that, look, the book actually also challenges orthodoxy, and the American commissioning world tends to be a little bit kind of concerned about you challenging orthodoxy. You know, there are things about Cassius X's personality that are not nearly as pleasant as the history of Muhammad Ali has been portrayed. I mean, he's quite an arrogant man. He was young. He was involved in running different relationships simultaneously. He would have not necessarily met the smell check of modernity. You know, there was things about him that were clearly exciting, but also risk-taking. And one of the things that I was keen to do, I don't think the film does this in the detail that I'm interested in because I'm a music obsessive, was that he was mentored as much by Sam Cooke, the musician, as he was by Malcolm X, his spiritual advisor. And Sam Cooke actually did, Sam Cooke helped him sign his first album deal, which was with Warner Brothers in New York. And he brought out an album when he was heavyweight champion of the world. And it was Sam Cooke that explained to him how the entertainment industry worked and how he had to shape himself as a figure of that industry. One of the things about Muhammad Ali that I will respect till the day I die is that he identified a moment in American popular cultural history where being on the cover of magazines was what made you famous, much more even than telly at that time, because telly was still an emergent medium. And if you put together all of the front covers of Muhammad Ali and framed them and put them round this room, people would just be gobsmacked about the things. Like one of the things I remember that he did that I write about in the book, and I kind of had as the first scene of the film in my mind, but I'm not the director. Remember, I'm the writer, right? They hire some guy to do the directing. Couldn't even get his flight up for London in time. Anyway, Muta obviously had his vision, but there's a photograph of Muhammad Ali, or Cassius X as he was then, and he's training in the 5th Street gym in Miami. And his friend, who was a local photographer, said to him, do you know what, I need something a bit different, something not just you boxing and posters around you in the ring and the punch bag, all that's been done, I need something different. He said, like what? He said, well, the Miami Symphony Orchestra rehearse across the road. Why don't I get one of them violinists and they could play the violin as you spar? And there's this wonderful photograph of Cassius X training as this kind of posh white violinist is playing him, and you see that photograph and you just think, what a brilliant start to a movie, you know. I'm thinking black screen, violin music floats up, we creep into the gym. You know, it's just so brilliantly filmic as a concept, and I think that he was one of the great transformative characters of 60s culture, in that he was just kind of the king of the front cover. There's the famous one of the martyrdom of San Sebastian. I don't know if you've seen that. And here is Muhammad Ali stripped to the waist with arrows sticking in his chest as if he's been martyred in a kind of medieval martyrdom. Brilliant, brilliant imagery, and so ahead of its time. So in a way, all of those things, I think, lead to him being a great figure for a film.
It was interesting what you said earlier about how you don't have an agent and you were kind of a bit involved with the optioning of the book and it becoming a film. How involved I guess this would have been a nice question for Musa as well, but I'm curious about the kind of working relationship you had as an author and as a director in adapting this book for film. How involved were you in kind of the production of it?
Well, curiously, not directly involved, because in a way, you know, I have and am, as it were, a film and TV producer in my own life, and I think sometimes there can be too many cooks, and you know, my idea of the violin and all the rest of it, that's my idea, it's not the director's idea. And so in a way I kept out of it, and I had regular meetings with Mick McAvoy, who was the exec, and he was interested in things that I could bring to the table, such as, you know, who of the following 8 people did you interview? And I would say, I interviewed this person, this person, and this person. How old are they? Are they capable of holding an interview? Are they still alive? Do you have a contact for them? So managerial and organisational things like that. And one of the things was I'd done an interview with Dee Dee Sharp. Now Dee Dee Sharp's she features in the film, but she's quite an important person in the story of that year in '63 in Miami. She was at the time probably one of the most famous African-American singers. She was a soul singer from Philadelphia who was the queen of dance craze music, which was at its absolute height in '62, '63. And she had a #1 R&B hit record called Mashed Potato USA, right? Do the mashed potato, right? You know, that was the dance. And she was actually a very, very famous dance craze singer. And she was living in New Jersey when I wrote the book, and I managed to track her down and sent her emails and went on her social media and talked to her by phone. And let me say something that I think's more something I learned with Detroit '67. As people age and as they look back on their lives, they mythologise things, quite substantially mythologise things, especially if they've had a little moment of fame or, you know, notoriety in their lives. And their mythology is often sometimes divorced from the truth, you know. And she was, for example, she was in love with Cassius, but they split up, and the film tells the story of them splitting up over the fact that she was from a Christian gospel family and he had converted to Islam. In fact, her mother, who was her chaperone and who spent all of the time with her in Miami when she was courting Cassius, was very, very commandeering and demanding, and she didn't really want to say that on camera. Not because her mum's long since passed away, but her sister's probably still alive, that kind of thing. So she ended up slightly mythologising her story. But, you know, that happens in life. I interviewed Martha Reeves of Martha and the Vandellas. I think I've interviewed her 4 times, and she came to an event. She was doing a 60s revival thing down in Ayr, and I went down to Ayr to the theatre and interviewed her backstage again for about the 4th time. And I think there's a side there thinking, oh, no, you again, right? And I sat down and interviewed her, and you say to her, well, I want to take you back to Detroit in the 1960s, and particularly the period when you were beginning she was a secretary at Motown for her first year, making her way up in the hierarchy of vocalists. And I said, I want to take you back to that day and tell me really where you are. She said, well, one of the things you've got to understand about Motown is we were one big happy family, right? And I said, Martha, you sued them on 4 different occasions. You know, and clearly that was construct, it was myth, it was what she's now become comfortable about telling. And I think that if we're all honest through our lives, we mythologise the stories we tell, we reflect back on all of that. And I think that in some respects the interview with Dee Dee Sharp, there's a little bit of that going on, but it's great to have her because she was Cassius's girlfriend. They were in love and they ended up splitting up over his religious beliefs or his conversion to Islam. Can I ask a question? Are there anybody that supports Celtic, the football club, in the audience? Now, there's one there, two, there's another one, three, four, they're all here today, right? Let me tell you this, here's a little glimpse into something you probably don't know. When Sam Cooke signed the entertainment contract for Muhammad Ali, or for Cassius X as he was then, they decided they would do some album together, some of the tracks together, and there's a great, it's on YouTube, but there's a great moment where they get together and they sing a song which is on Cassius's album. He's got an album, I think, about 8 tracks in it. And one of the songs he sings only on the album, it was never a single, only in the album, is what's called the Celtic song, right? And the Celtic song is Hail, Hail, the Celts are here, la da 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 da. And what Sam Cooke and Cassius sing is Hail, Hail, the gang's all here. And they do exactly the same song. And you can see a wee glimpse of it on YouTube. Just put Muhammad Ali, Sam Cooke, Hail, Hail, and it will come up, right? And there's just something astonishing about that, you know. So there's always that little sprinkle of Scottish football in there somewhere.
Scotland's everywhere, exactly.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the book mainly focuses on the year 1963.
It does, yeah.
And
So that's the connection back to the trilogy. It
Yeah.
was set in a year where I was looking, and it never really, it leaves a city. It jumps from Miami to London to Philadelphia, so it breaks one of the cardinal rules of the trilogy, but it's not the trilogy, and I used Miami 63 as the kind of focal point, you know.
Mm-hmm. But in the film, it covers more than just 1963. It covers a
Yeah.
kind of 5-year timeline.
Yeah, yeah.
And that covers, you know, Cassius X's conversion to Islam. Did you, in that sense, you know, the film departs from the book in that way?
Yes.
Did you have any input into that?
No, not really. I mean, I think that there's a natural ending to the book, and I actually think a natural ending to the story, which is that Muhammad Ali makes a decision when he converts, that at the time of his conversion, he's built up this friendship with Malcolm X, but Malcolm X, over that period of time, is gradually falling out with the Nation of Islam, and has actually been effectively expelled from the organisation. And the Nation of Islam firebomb his home in Queens, where he's refusing to leave his house, so the Nation of Islam firebomb it to get him out the house. It's a Nation of Islam own own the home, and they want him out. But this is Malcolm X, their most famous ever preacher. So it's ending up in a fairly sad moment, and in the end, Cassius X has to make a choice whether he goes with Malcolm X to what was then a nascent new organisation called the United African Movement. I forgot the exact title of it, but it's Malcolm X's new organisation, and leave the nation. And he decides to stay with the core religion and turns his back on Malcolm X. And the two of them never really speak again. They meet once in Africa on a retreat, but they never ever speak again. And probably, I think it ends for me there. So that's probably in the summer of 64. So he's won the heavyweight title of the world, and it finishes in 64. And I think that's the natural ending of the story. I think that there's probably more you can glean from that, but ultimately it stops you having to go into other big elements of the story, like his refusal to fight at the war in Vietnam, those kinds of things, which are kind of new stories almost. They're new chapters in the story. Important, hugely dramatic, but unless you're doing a cradle to the grave biopic, you have to end somewhere.
Yeah. We talked about optioning earlier, so
Yeah.
I'd be remiss not to ask you about Boy 313, which is your
Company,
IP company.
Yeah.
Could you talk about how that company came to be?
Yeah, okay, so basically the company's probably been a year in existence or 25 years in existence, depending on how it goes. my colleague and friend and company owner, Paul McGuigan, and I worked together with the company I used to own, which was called Big Star, which was based out in the east end of the city at the old Black Cat Studios. And we had a commission from Channel 4 back in the glory days when you could win big commissions from Channel 4. And one of the elements of it was to produce a Friday night show called Halfway to Paradise, but one of the elements of it was also to develop talent. And I think we had 4 or 5 people who were at the company making short films for the show, but also developing their skills and their talent. And Paul was one of them, Paul McGuigan was one of them. There was endless numbers of other people who came through that route. But Paul and I remained very close, so when I went down to work at Channel 4, he came and produced a few things. We did a thing called Walk in the Wild Side, which was a series of documentaries about people living their lives on the edge. And one that I think was an absolutely brilliant film he made, was about people that were fire raisers, that were obsessed with arson, and they were kind of compelled to watch buildings burn. And so it was things. It wasn't like kind of like, oh, he's a mod, or it was actually really compelling storylines. And he then, with me, we made The Acid House, the low-budget feature film, which he directed. And then this was at the time that Trainspotting was a global hit, and it was Film 4. And I remember a conversation in Film 4 where they said, this Trainspotting, any more of the Scottish shit that you've got? And I'm thinking, endless, I could give you 400 of them. So we went back to Irvin's Acid House trilogy, and Paul composed a kind of quartet from the Acid House, and turned into a really successful low-budget feature, which at the time was also using 90s music, and it was really brilliant. I mean, arguably, if you're having that debate about Trainspotting versus Acid House, it's a subject in its own right. You could have a real colloquium on that. It's a good one for Glasgow Film Festival next year, which is the best of the two. And Paul and I remained close. He then went on to direct a range of really successful films. So you're going back to begin with things like Lucky Number 11 and Gangster Number 1, and then and more recently,
Film Stars Don't Die.
Film Stars Don't Die in Liverpool, last year, but also Sherlock and Scandal, and he's currently out in the States. He's got an output deal in America, so we work together online and Zoom, and he's home often enough for us to have long kind of development. And then my friend Paul Murray, who I worked with again at Channel 4, but he'd come more out of the kind of features and factual TV development world, and we were pretty close too. And during COVID, or in the run-up to COVID, we had a meeting. We were all having, we had to drink outside, that's what it was. So we had this kind of tent where we were outside drinking, and we decided, let's go for this and rebuild again and set up a new company. And we had an idea that I'd taken from the Soul trilogy called Boy 313. 313 is the dialing code for Detroit, and our first project, which is in development just now, was the story of the FBI under the so-called CONTOPRO legislation, where they were using obscenely unfair and criminal activity to undermine black power groups and other radical groups within American society. And they were bugging people, particularly at that time, Martin Luther King, who didn't die until the year later. So he emerges in the Detroit book because he arrives in Detroit in the Easter, and the FBI are already tailing him and bugging his hotel rooms and bugging the what do you call these things when you're in a church, and it's the pulpit, bugging the pulpit underneath where he's speaking. And my wee boy Jack had been diagnosed with autism, and I just threw in the creative idea, what if the man who's the engineer that's bugging Martin Luther King, who was white, what if he had an autistic son who's learning the dark arts as they go, and that's the boy of Boy 313. So it's a 14-part series for American TV. It's not a feature film, it's a drama series, and it's currently out and being punted to various people. We've had one rejection, but we're hopeful that we'll move on. And it's of a slate. I think we've got about 20 things, Seamus, on the slate, and we've got Seamus is the development director, development head there, and I think we've got a really exciting slate of things. Not all American facing, and not all from my books, far from it, but nonetheless they're exciting projects, some of which are feature based, some of which are drama.
I'm cautious that, I mean, we could talk for another 2 hours, I think, because you have so much, you have so many interesting stories. But I know before we wrap up that we should probably open up to audience questions if anyone wants to ask anything. Yeah?
You've got such an incredible background, coming from both writing books and film and television, and this isn't your first option for Cassius X. You've kind of been through it loads of times. Was there anything about this process that was new or surprised you? Was there anything I haven't had to deal with that?
One of the things that surprises me, one of the things that surprises me, and it shouldn't really, because I've been the advocate of this throughout my life, is that 98% of what you get is no, and in some respects you're always kind of pursuing that 2% where you can convert it into either commission or into investment or in your feature. And in lots of ways, I'm kind of inured to rejection now because I've sort of protected myself from it. But I think that that's one of the reasons why I like having a diverse slate, because I used to have this thing at Channel 4, and it was about fratricide, and it was about infanticide, and you have to learn to be able to kill your children and kill the things most precious to you. And I know that Boy 313, which is really precious to me, not the company, the project, may never happen, and I might have to go, oh, that brilliant idea I had in that tent one night when we were drinking wine and the world was closing down on us. The cunts don't want to. I will have to accept that we'll have to let it go. And I think the capacity to be able to pursue to the nth degree things you love and you believe in, and then to reach a moment in your life where you're strong enough to kill them off and move on to another project. It's not the easiest thing in the world, particularly if you're truly in love with a story. And that might happen because the story, I've personalised it with my son and the autism thing. That can happen when the story is personally, about something in your life or about someone close to you in their life. It's not an easy thing to do, but we have regular meetings. I've got a meeting actually tomorrow where we go through the slate and we think, what more can we do with this? Is it dead? Is it alive? Is it something we want to take somewhere else? Is it got another kind of manifestation? How many no's have we had on this project? I had to live with my latest book, the book that's actually out now, is called Hey America, Black Music in the White House. And conceptually is a book perfect. It is the story of the evolution and development of black American music against the backdrop of who was the president in the White House at the time. And it's seamlessly, it folds down. It's a brilliant, brilliant idea. But a lot of people say, too big in scale, we want to focus down on a period. We're much more interested in Reagan and, AIDS, for example. He was instrumentally part of the kind of failure of the AIDS pandemic in America. And I think we've been rejected by everybody in Britain, and we own it, so it's something that sooner or later I'll have to accept, look in the mirror one day and say, great book, shame about the film,
Does anyone else have a question? Over there. Yeah. I'll wait for the mic first before.
You mentioned, you mentioned that you knew Mick and Alan from Two Rivers already when they approach you about the project. But if
Yeah.
a production company doesn't have an existing relationship with a writer and is approaching them pretty cold,
Yeah.
how do you feel that's best approached? Assuming it's the writer rather than the rights agency, should they focus
Yeah,
on the
that's a
business
good
proposal,
question
or-
because I knew Alan and Mick from Two Rivers already, separate from Two Rivers. Long before Two Rivers even existed, I knew them as individuals. Mick, incidentally, is from Kilmarnock, and if you follow him on Twitter, I think he's one of the best Twitter handles of all time. It's just Killy Me Softly. Get it? Killy Me Softly? Love it. Anyway, so I kind of knew them both, and that really does help because sitting down with them becomes, a matter of fact. But there's been, like, for example, when Altitude bid for the trilogy, I didn't know them at all from Adam. And I remember actually going down to a hotel in Soho. I didn't even know what they looked like. And, I went in this hotel and we'd arranged we were going to meet in there and discuss it. And then you see two people, they're filmmakers. I can tell by the shoes, right? So they came over. They buy the extremely overpriced wine. And we sat and we talked about it. And in lots of ways, I'm not going to kind of make a big deal of this. Sorry, I'm covering the microphone. I thought they'd approached it far too much from the perspective of music rather than narrative. And they were seeking to make a series of music documentaries. And there's only so much that you can nudge the person because they are buying the rights. And you don't want to kind of be the person that says, you know what, these aren't the right books for you, fuck off and do something else. You can't do that. Nor can you actually say, and I know more than you do, because they've made endless documentaries and endless films. They've got a great track record. So I sat, I listened, and I kind of brought up a few of what I thought were some of the great characters in the books, collectively, all three of them. So, for example, just to give you an example there's a character in the Harlem book called Fat Jack Taylor. Now, Jack Taylor used to run a company called Rojack Records in Harlem, but he was the heroin dealer for the Apollo Theatre, the great Apollo Theatre, probably the kind of greatest African-American soul venue of all time. But he was also somebody that spent all of the money that he made from selling heroin recording what he considered to be brilliant women singers who were in decline, whose careers were in decline. So there's a woman called Lily Bryant, Big Maybelle. I mean, these were often kind of people who'd come out of the R&B scene where glossy soul music had passed them by, but they were just brilliant singers. And so there's a way where you're thinking, here's this guy, he actually ends up dying of gangrene and gets his leg chopped off and he dies. But Fat Jack Taylor's a really, really interesting character, but none of his records ever made it. So they're not, if you're kind of looking to do something like, for example, end up sort of saying, well, here were the hits of the 80s or the 90s or the 70s, the books aren't the right place to begin. And I was trying to kind of coax them into greater storytelling. But they were very friendly, they wanted the rights, they've still got the rights. I speak to them maybe every 2 or 3 months. And it's them just updating me where they are. The latest update I had was that Nile Rodgers of Chic is on board as the director, the actual filmmaking director. His book for being able to get people to participate is huge. So they're obviously looking at it from the point of view of making it in America and making it of scale. But if you don't know them, I don't think I had the same level of kind of aggressiveness of argument that I would have had. I think I was probably a little bit shy and keen to get the deal done rather than keen to see what they were alike. So I think it varies. But in the main, if you see something that you like or read something you like, nothing wrong with just ringing the publisher or the author's agent and saying, I'm keen to option this, what's the current option status of it? And they'll say, well, currently no one's optioning it, or it's got an option but it's due to run out, what would you be interested in doing? And then you're in the debate about how much you could afford to make. I don't know where we are just now with the Creative Scotland Scottish Screen Development money, but I know that they are always keen to develop Scottish authors or literary content from Scotland, and I think they still fund option. You know, they would put the funding of an option into a development budget as part of their plans. That's my understanding of it anyway.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Yeah, there's one over there. Mike's coming around.
Hello. Oh, I don't know if it's working. So this might be a bit of a difficult question, but like, it sounds like you've done, as a writer, you've kind of focused a lot on quite culturally significant stories to like African Americans especially.
Yeah.
But like, I'm guessing that's come with its own challenges, you know, and especially with people saying, "Oh, that's not your story to tell," etc. You know, stuff like that. What's been your experience in trying to tell these stories, and what advice would you give to someone trying to tell a story that's maybe outside of their kind of
cultural,
what might be seen as their cultural knowledge?
So basically, it's a good question, and one that I do get asked, and one that I'm actually, if I don't get asked, I ask myself and then answer it, is that, you know, we're living in a period where there's a great deal of cultural sensitivity around all sorts of areas of culture. And, you know, I began as an advocate and obsessive about soul music, as it was, soul and Motown, as a kid growing up in Scotland, in Perth, where I was born. And I've stayed with it throughout my entire life as a music journalist, as a commissioner, and it's something that's kind of lifelong. But I set myself some ground rules. So if you take, for example, the cultural appropriation debate, or the debate about, you know, who has the right to tell certain stories, you know, I feel that we've all got the right to tell stories, and that we can see those stories from different perspectives, but you have to set yourself some reasonable ground rules. And one thing that I did quite early on, actually, and when I was writing Detroit 67, was that there was a huge controversy in 1967 around the Pulitzer Prize. The Pulitzer Prize was won by William Styron, one of the great American writers of his era, and he had written a book about the escaped slave Nat Turner and the slave rebellions going back to the period of slavery, and it became a cause célèbre within America at the time. And the debate was so kind of fractious and argumentative, it became part of the kind of whole debate within African American literature at the time, when some of the big names of African American literature were around and working in Harlem. And I followed the debate very, very closely. And at the core of the debate is an issue that has stayed with me as a red line, which is, I'm not black, I'm from Perth in Scotland. That doesn't mean I can't write about music of Black America, but what William Styron had done with the slave narrative is that he had written in the first person as the slave. Now, as a white privileged author with a fairly, at his time, a fairly decent income, living in kind of genteel Manhattan, or the genteel parts of Manhattan, he was making the presumption that he could write through the experiences of slavery without any great kind of rationale behind that, and that's what caused the controversy. So, for example, I never ever write in the first person as if I am black. I never write in the first person as if the character that I'm putting words into the mouth of, that's a black character, I'm assuming. Even actually, when I remember I told you about the snowstorm that had trapped Berry Gordy in his house, whilst I tell you what's going on at that time at Motown, I don't presume I'm inside his mind and articulating it as character conversation. I describe it as a third party observing what's going on, and that's been a red line for me, which allows me, at least from my point of view, to navigate my way through the whole controversy around that. Now, you know, there'll be some people say, well, you're doing this from a period of white privilege, but and that's certainly the case, but I'm not doing it to deny anyone else the right to write these books. You know, it's a free world. If you want to write about any city in any form of music, you know, you know, knock yourself out, go ahead and do it. My books don't prevent that happening. And the other thing about it is culture's also a world of exchange. And that's one of the things that fascinates me about culture. So all joking apart, I always love saying, I wish Muta was here because he loves this one when I do it, which is I always turn around and say, yes, that Maya Angelou, I believe she was quite a big figure in African American literature. And she did her master's degree on Robert Burns. How dare she write about Scotland, right? You know, so yeah, I kind of do it just to kind of play the trick. So if I ever feel that somebody's got to me at an event like this and they've dug further and they've chastised me or challenged me, I go home, I pour myself a glass of wine and I turn on Ella Fitzgerald's version of Loch Lomond. And I feel very relaxed about life.
We probably have time for one more quick question. I see a hand over there.
Hello. I'm an actor that sort of moved into screenwriting, so I'm still figuring out all the different ways of getting things produced. So I'm really curious what your view is on this like increasing push in the industry of having existing IP, and what you think like of people that are predominantly filmmakers writing prose retrospectively to try and make that project happen. I'm just curious.
So sorry, say just that last bit again.
What you think of people who are predominantly filmmakers writing prose retrospectively in order to try and get a project happen? I'm just curious.
So writing a story.
Yeah, writing a book or writing a short story
to get it made.
Made.
Well, one of the things that I would recommend there is that one of the things that books still have, and you know, they come in many forms, the ebook, and you know, but one of the things that they still assert is that they're an asset. You can walk into a room and put it on the table. You can turn around and say, it's out next week. We're really excited about it. It's getting rave reviews. It is an asset, and that's one of the things that I would always talk up about. If we make up ideas all the time. I've got one good idea, I'll not dwell too much on it, but we've got a very good idea called The Originals, and it's predicated on a series of articles that Seamus had read in New York, and it's to some extent a very clever modern crime thriller. But if we had not stumbled on the articles, it probably wouldn't have given us the idea. Now, we've taken it so far away from the original article, you would barely be able to see the seams. But I think actually having an asset that you can put down in front of a commissioner really, really helps. So my agencies, I don't have an agent, but the literary agent that runs the company, I've got agents next week in Scotland from all over the world, or next month in Scotland from all over the world, and they say, oh well, we want to show them, you know, the success of Cassius X and all the rest of it, and there's still a side of me thinks, oh, don't give them away too many books, they're meant to be sold, I'm meant to get paid from the sales of the book. But it's a very powerful thing to be able to put down, rather than just say, oh, I have a memory of what it was like being 18 in Glasgow. If you look at Shuggie Bain now, Shuggie Bain probably will get made, and made relatively well, on the basis of a book. Whereas hundreds of people in this room could have probably said, oh, my upbringing in Glasgow, it wasn't great. You know, you can say that, but you can't necessarily, you know, get it made until there is substance in it, a script, or in his case, a novel, you know.
Amazing. Yeah, that's all we have time for. It's sad Musa couldn't make it, but you can see him and Stuart when Cassius X screens on Thursday and Friday. And yeah, get tickets if you haven't already. It's a brilliant documentary. And thank you so much, Stuart. This has been so great.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you so much.
Okay, good. Well done. Thank you.